So this is Conservation Café. I'm Eliza Cava, the Conservation Director of Audubon Naturalist Society. We're headquartered in Chevy Chase, Maryland, out of our sanctuary at Woodend Nature Center, which is free and open to the public every day, including during the pandemic. You can't come in the building, but you can come and walk our trails and visit our restored meadow, and we'd love to have you over. And our Conservation Café series is part of our conservation department, which I direct. We do policy, advocacy, community science, and outreach and engagement around the region around conservation issues. And so this is part of our outreach programming to bring diverse voices of people who practice and are engaged with conservation in a wide variety of ways. And from the beginning, we have had some focus on kind of traditional nature conservation, but because we're really embedded in this urban and suburban space, we've always focused on, since Conservation Café started in 2017, the intersection of what it means when people and nature are kind of sharing space, because that's what it means to live anywhere really, but particularly in an urban and suburban area. And so when I get to Maisie's introduction, that's just a little background as to why it's so particularly exciting that we get to have her on tonight. Conservation Café is a fee-based program. It has been since before it was virtual. We really appreciate your paying the fees. That allows us to pay honorariums to our speakers, and it supports the conservation program in a couple of other ways, in particular allowing us to get more learning and go to conferences, and support some of our travel needs to be able to move around the region, a couple of other expenses that we pay most of our salaries and things out of grants. So just to let everybody know that your contribution tonight supports both Maisie and her work with the Urban Studio, among many other things that she does, and the ANS Conservation Program. We are recording. The recording will be available to all registrants as soon as possible, probably tomorrow, Monday at the latest. And we'll make it available for a donation, which will be split between the Urban Studio and ANS for a period of time afterwards, exact period of time to be determined, and then for free available to the public after that. So we appreciate your support in helping make this programming possible. So, and for those who don't know us, the Audubon Naturalist Society is the oldest independent environmental organization in the DC area. We have conservation programs, which I already told you about, in environmental education programs for kids, adults, and families, and restoration of our sanctuary. And we do have two sanctuaries, our headquarters in Chevy Chase, and we also have Russ Sanctuary in Leesburg, Virginia. So that's our introduction to our organization. Again, thank you all for coming. I'll tell you a little bit more about how we're going to work tonight. First of all, if you'd like to use social media, please tweet us or use Facebook. _Urban Studio for Maisie, and ANS tweets for Eliza Cava for myself. And here's how you can participate. Oh shoot, I forgot to change from my last panelist. This is not about Vernice, this is about Maisie. Anytime you see Vernice on this slide, think Maisie, my apologies. Anyway, there's a couple of tools that you should be able to see on your screen. You have the chat window, which many of you have already used. Please use the chat function to interact with other attendees. But you also have a Q&A window, Q&A button, which has little speech bubbles. Please use those to submit questions that you want me to ask Maisie. I will be moderating a series of questions, some of which we have prepared in advance, but I also really want your questions to help us make this a really rich discussion. So use that Q&A tool. I'll be able to track the questions easily as they come in, much more easily than through the chat window. And if it's a very easy question, I might answer it in writing if it's a sort of logistical question that I know the answer to, but otherwise I will incorporate it into asking Maisie questions. Maisie will do most of the talking. I will ask questions. That's my job here. And if you're only joining by phone, which I do think we have a couple of phone call-in listeners, and you would like to send a question, I will be checking my email a few times, and you can email me, eliza.cava@anshome.org. It's the same address you got your confirmations from. So if you have a question that you can't submit through the Q&A, I can't promise I will get to it as promptly as through the Q&A box, but I will check a few times before the end my email. All right. And if you have technical needs, use the chat rather than the Q&A or my email. If you're having a technical problem, email me, chat, whatever, I'll try to get you taken care of. And we have a couple other ANS staff on who may be able to help as well. Oh, and in the Q&A window, once we start getting a lot of Q&As, questions, which I'm sure we will, because you're just going to want to know more about what Maisie has to say, then you can upvote one another's questions so that I know there's a question that has a lot of interest from the audience. All right. Moving on. oh, that's it. That's my last slide. So I'm going to get rid of that and stop screen sharing. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Maisie, and I'm going to give you what I consider a personal introduction, and let Maisie take the lead on most of her professional introduction and what she wants to emphasize. What I want to tell you is when I first met or heard of Maisie, she was a speaker at Taking Nature Black in February of 2020, which was days before everything shut down. I just can't believe that we had that many people in a room holding hands and yelling power together on February 27th, but we did. And Maisie was a panelist on a panel about careers and getting involved in green careers. And she just spoke so passionately about the importance of breaking in and mentorship and creating pathways that really work for people and not kind of waving your hands and thinking like, oh, we have a pipeline problem. I'm paraphrasing here, but it wasn't really about what she did professionally. It was a little bit about what she did professionally, but she was such an engaging speaker that I wanted to pay attention to her, and I wanted other people to pay attention to her. And so we first were asking Maisie, who among many other things has a landscaping business. First, we were going to ask Maisie to present on a Garden Stories conference about landscaping specifically. And I don't know if that speaking opportunity ever even happened, but it turns out that I saw the video of her, the recording. I was reminded again of what she said at Taking Nature Black. And I said, I want her for Conservation Café. So some of Maisie's businesses and adventures include her landscaping business. Unfortunately, I don't have the name in front of me, and I'll ask you to make sure to say it later. The Urban Studio, which is a nonprofit that she started in graduate school with fellow landscape architects to really dive in deep on what landscape architecture can mean for urban spaces and people who live in urban spaces. She is with American Forests, of which we have a lot of connections with the Audubon Naturalist Society, which is really exciting. We get a lot of advice from American Forests, and we have a lot of partnerships. And what's cool about her position, which is in urban forestry, is that it's just so connected with what I was saying earlier. Conservation in an urban and a suburban landscape. What does it mean to conserve nature when there not only is there the concept of wilderness, is gone from the world, but also there's nothing close to it here in our area. And even if there was, what would that mean to be really focused on preserving it and only it when we have so many people who need access to nature all around us? And so those are some of the questions we're going to be talking about, and those are some of the questions that I think Maisie gets to work on in her role in urban forestry. And I probably missed some other elements of her professional background, but I'm going to let her emphasize what she wants to you about that, because the last thing I wanted to say is that when I had a pre-call with Maisie to talk about what we were going to talk about tonight, she just went off. It was great. Like, her passion for this, her upending of some traditional thinking is really, really exciting, and I think important all the time, but important for the moment. I think if we're in a moment where we want to hear new ways of doing things, we need to know how to fix stuff. And I'm not going to tell you that Maisie has all the answers, but I'm going to tell you that if you think about things in a different way, maybe we will find new pathways together. So on to Maisie.
Wow. That was a very exciting and a humbling introduction. Thank you for that. I hope that my presentation and the things that I have to say will live up to that wonderful introduction. I do want to start with someone who has become very important to me. And I would love to share the screen, Eliza, if you can provide that. It says that it's disabled at this point. Here we go. All right. This is Quentin. Quentin was one of the 10 students that I got to work with last fall. What's amazing about Quentin is that he was 17 years old at the time that this picture was taken. He's in AP Calculus. He's in Honors Humanities. He was taking AP Psychology. He was an incredibly competitive young man. He's a student leader and a student athlete. He lives in this place you may have heard of called the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is home to 18 million people. and it manages 18 trillion gallons of stormwater annually. However, a lot of this stormwater is polluted, and it ends up right in Quentin's neighborhood. He lives in the most impaired tributary to the Anacostia River. It's the Hickey Run subwatershed. And the great thing about being a landscape architect is that we've been designing systems to help clean stormwater for a very long time. And so landscape architecture has a lot to offer Quentin. Not only could it solve some of his problems right at home, it could actually be a career for him. Landscape architecture could dramatically improve Quentin's life. So why doesn't Quentin want to be a landscape architect? And that is the question. I got to work with Quentin for 10 weeks and could not change his mind. But this is critical when we're thinking about how we're designing cities and how we're designing places. And because I work at the intersection of arboriculture, landscape architecture, and urban planning, I think about these things all the time. And the reason that I came up with for why he doesn't want to be a landscape architect ties back to this concept of invisibility. And I could not ever say it as well as Ralph Ellison said it. I am the invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, a man of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because you refuse to see me. And not only is Quentin invisible to landscape architecture, but before working with us, landscape architecture was invisible to him. And so I am Maisie Hughes. I do a lot of interesting things to try and help solve some of these challenges that we have in urban areas. I'm a landscape architect. I own Design Virtue, a landscape consulting firm. I am the co-founder of the Urban Studio. But probably really critical to this discussion tonight, I was a 2018-2019 Innovation and Leadership Fellow for the Landscape Architecture Foundation. When we started the Urban Studio after I completed my fellowship with LAF, we wanted to think about cities differently. We wanted to solve this problem of invisibility, but we wanted to solve it because we believe that not only should people participate in designing their own cities, we need people to participate so that we can transform cities to make them equitable places. And so the mission of the Urban Studio is to advance design thinking for equitable and sustainable urbanism. And this wonderful one-year fellowship that I experienced was all rooted in this idea of transformational leadership. We had mentoring up and down and laterally. We proposed our own projects and we worked on them for a year. It was 3 months of work, but it was spread over the term of a year. We did 3 residencies together in Washington, DC. We had check-in calls monthly. We got a significant financial investment from Landscape Architecture Foundation, but most importantly, the ideas that we came up with were ours. And we were exposed to a lot of people in the industry. And so our projects unfolded over the year in a very organic way, in a very supportive environment. And you may recognize some of our board members at the Urban Studio from that photo before, because we're all sort of connected through the Landscape Architecture Foundation. We have Kendra Hyson, who is a co-founder with me, who was on the board of LAF when we started. We have Drew, who does all of our tech stuff. We have Davi, who's a landscape architect, an urban planner, and a fine artist. We have me, and you know all of my credentials. We have Jen Lowe, who is a wonderful registered landscape architect, a designer, and she does art. And to get really at the intergenerational approach that we have to our work, we have Jelani here, who is our most recent student board member, who we love, and he was part of that original program with Quentin when we launched our pilot. We are a missions-based organization with values that center our work. Our 5 values are authentic and meaningful engagement, intergenerational leadership and mentorship, design as liberation, co-design and co-creation with communities of color, and of course, we always want to elevate experts of lived experience. Because we're all trying to reach what we think cities should be. We want to create a world where all people have the means to create healthy, vibrant, and just communities. And we think we can do this through design. And so that's the work that I do with the Urban Studio. And that's what we wanted to share with you today to help frame the discussion. And so, Eliza, I'm going to allow you to ask me all of the questions, and the audience can, of course, participate in this process. And we can talk a little bit more about how we can make better cities.
Great, great, thank you. Thanks for sharing Quentin's story. You know, maybe we can start with this idea of co-creating and co-designing. We've talked a lot about what it means to get people involved, and that's the whole goal behind the programs that you did with Quentin and others. What does it really look like when communities are co-creating and co-designing their space, and how is that different from the way spaces are usually designed?
Well, anybody who's ever been to a community meeting understands that the design process, which will have huge impacts for communities, right, has become this perfunctory performance where the designers are only obligated to engage with the community on 3 separate occasions. And they have community meetings, they barely listen, they don't incorporate feedback. A lot of times you'll find that designers will be very condescending in this process. And when this happens, people are left out of this process. So we think co-design and co-creation requires 2 things. It requires that we teach communities about the design process, which is what we do. And we work with different age ranges of people, but we do start with those who are 16-year-olds because we want to capture them right before they decide where they go to college and try to convince them to get into the design field. But we also need to work with designers so that they can actually listen to communities, right? The important thing to understand is that nobody will understand a landscape better than the people who live in that landscape. And so you may be a landscape architect, or you may be a conservationist, or you may be just a person who loves to plant trees. You're not going to understand the context of that neighborhood the way those people who live there do. And we have to figure out a way to get that information and make that part of how we design our spaces. A lot of times, in a lot of places, we're grappling with displacement or gentrification, but a lot of that has to do with a design process that only invests in communities when it's time for development. So one of the things we want to do is to get people to invest in existing communities, and for communities to trust that if a representative from the government or from a design firm is coming in there, they're not coming in there with the purpose of creating a place that they will no longer be able to afford, but they're coming in there with a purpose of enhancing existing community. And that doesn't happen. And so this idea that the people who live in a place should be valued in this process isn't new. We're just reminding people of what urban planning is supposed to be. And we're trying to make sure that people have enough tools to have those conversations in an intelligent way.
So if people are coming into the process in a way that is actually equitable and open, how do the results differ? What do people look for that, in your experience, and let's speak specifically about a city, within a city. Heck, we could even speak specifically about within Washington, D.C. But in your experience, what are the ways that the results differ when people really get involved versus when they're only brought in at the end?
Yeah, I think that the results could be tremendously different. You can inform the nature of the work from the very beginning if cities were listening. I have been very active in my neighborhood association. Years before the district government wanted to build a new recreation center, we had collected information from the residents about what they wanted to see. We included that in the design process, and we had to like fight tooth and nail to get people to listen to us. And we're like, hey, we're doing pre-work for you. Like, we're telling you what we want. We're trying to, you know, make sure that we're all part of the process. But, you know, the way things work now, people are not prepared to accept that information ahead of, you know, the green light to start the process, right? And so we need to transform the way the process happens, and we have to get on board really early in these projects to even inform the scope of work in such a way that we can get responses from designers who are willing to collaborate in an authentic way with communities, right? And so it can start from the very beginning. And engagement can be more than just 3 public meetings. One of the great things about going virtual is that it allows for more people who wouldn't otherwise be able to attend a public meeting to learn and gather information on their own. But it's also an opportunity for younger people to be part of the process and for older people to be heard in the process, neither of which really happens the way we plan for cities now. And so when we piloted the Studio DC project, where Clinton was involved, we actually had the students work with us over 10 weeks to redesign the recreation center, the actual recreation center in my neighborhood that was getting rebuilt. And so that they can understand the design process based on a real site as part of a process that was really happening on the ground. Of course, they were super creative and wonderful designs that were not feasible in the budget that we were given, but that process opened up career opportunities for students who didn't know anything about designing for their own neighborhoods prior to our intervention.
I said, so when you talk about getting involved in the process, you make it sound pretty organic. Like if the planners would just come and ask, the neighborhoods are already getting involved. But I think there's power involved.
Of course, yes.
So let's talk about power. How do we make sure that, let's be specific. And this is one of the pre-questions, so don't use, you know, this one's on the table already. But we've got communities of color in DC and elsewhere who are already the most impacted by redlining, although DC did not actually experience redlining, experienced different kinds of lining, basically, in other ways. Disinvestment as a result, then pollution, and now COVID, and those things all build on one another so that it's almost exponential. So, and space is a healer of many of those things. Green space, access to green space, places to recreate with clean air, places to spread out and socially distant talk with one another instead of being crammed inside. So, I mean, I think everything comes back to power. That's why I work in advocacy. But what have you seen and what do you wish we can see in this process that generates power in communities that currently lack it?
Yeah. Oh, this is a wonderful conversation to have at this moment in time. I see that kind of displacement is by design. It's not by accident. A lot of times when you're engaging in these processes, even the planners don't really have the ability to make decisions that can change the game, even though technically that's supposed to be their responsibility. But we know that the growth of development in urban places is a process that is articulated by the mayor in the Office of Planning. We know this to be a fact. But we also know that those engagements and how that information is communicated isn't done in a way that residents can participate easily or understand sort of the consequences of their decisions. You'll get 3 choices and you'll get to pick one, but you don't ever really think about what it means to pick one of these 3 choices. And that's because cities are dynamic and complicated places to be. But I don't think that we're trying hard enough to really dive a little bit deeper into how these decisions are being made. And I think the thing that I see most is do-gooders who are unaware of their own bias or who are complicit in this process. A lot of times we can get into polarizing conversations. We can say this group of people are bad because they don't like these kinds of, and I'm gonna say sustainable ideas, like we're gonna say bike lanes, we're gonna say, we can even say trees, we can say, stormwater design, that people who don't like those things are wrong. And we can be really closed-minded in the process and not listening to that group of people. And a lot of times the people who are designing for a street or a neighborhood or a process will be in the city for a couple of years, design a project, get a little bit of shine, get a little bit of glory, and then move on to the next city. And what's left behind are the people who have to live with that design. And if that design doesn't work for them for some reason, and they participate in the process and they say that this design doesn't work for me, and they go and they're not heard, they're the ones who are stuck with it. And so that is alarming to me, especially because I'm an environmentalist, I'm a landscape architect, and I want to be on the right side of the issue. Like, I want to be making decisions for neighborhoods that work for those neighborhoods. I want to have people participate in a process in which they benefit in the end. And that, unfortunately, is not happening. It's not just that people are conservative and carbon is bad and that all of this pollution is happening. It is also that the people who are supposed to be designing solutions for those problems are hard-headed and stubborn and don't listen, unfortunately. And so we're all frustrated, right? Because if you are a person who doesn't have much agency in this process, and the people are polluting in your neighborhood, and the people who come in who are supposed to solve the problems don't listen to you, then you're doubly screwed. And that is what's happening in urban areas. And that is a huge problem. And we need to learn, the people who think that they're on the right side of these issues need to learn how to listen.
So if we assume that every person attending tonight is an environmentalist also, we probably all see ourselves as do-gooders.
Yes.
So what's your advice then on what to do as do-gooders to not screw up in these ways? And only some of us are actually engaged on the planning or the design side of things, but this is not only a public and professional issue, this is a private one, of course. Yeah. But the way you've seen it play out, yeah, how do do-gooders actually do a better job?
Yes. That's an excellent question. I think it all starts with listening, but not the kind of, I'm sort of kind of listening to you and I'm sort of on my smartphone at the same time kind of listening. It has to be the kind of deep listening that even if the person doesn't use the right term, or even if the person disagrees with you, that you can put yourself into their position and see what it is that they need that you're not giving them. And that never happens, almost never happens. I think we get our toolboxes of solutions. We go into a community meeting. We're like, you've got this problem. We've got these solutions. Which ones do you want us to use, right? But we need a broader set of tools in order to solve these problems. And one of the things that I found out about recently that I hadn't even known about, which shocks me, is the idea that, a lot of the communities that we're working in are communities who are experiencing deep trauma, deep, long-held systemic trauma. And that's not, something that's going to be solved by design alone. That's got to be part of a larger process of healing. And if we're not trauma informed and we're working in urban areas, then we're not getting it. You know, if we notice that we don't have the diversity of people participating in our programs, and we're wondering what's wrong with those people for not want to participate in our wonderful programs, then we're missing something. And we're probably missing that they've got bigger fish to fry. They have, a system of trauma. They have a different set of priorities, many of which require them to be paid for their time. And if we're saying that we're having a voluntary program, but we're not paying people to participate, then, then people will change their choice. If we have, a summer program for kids, but it's really just putting kids, to water trees all summer and to mulch trees all summer, but they're not really learning anything in the process, but they're outside in the heat watering trees in Washington, D.C., for example, all summer. And they have the choice of doing that or getting paid more to work at McDonald's with air conditioning and free French fries for the summer. Any 16-year-old in their 16-year-old mind will choose, give me the French fries and the air conditioning. We're not making these careers, these jobs, these opportunities, this transformation we want to see in the city appetizing to people who we want to serve. And so we have to rethink how we address, market, engage, and work with people who are coming from traumatic backgrounds a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to share with you something that this actually just happened to me sort of today. I'm working on an issue that is about stormwater and stream protection in Montgomery County. And, our streams all over the region are very heavily impacted by lots of things. Urban stream syndrome, stormwater is one of them. This is for the benefit of our audience. I know you know these things. And so there's many different things we can do to try to heal them. There's so many strategies you can take in different places, and all of them would benefit some streams. But we chose to work on a particular issue that was really impacting a key component of our coalition's membership. And we've done a lot of analysis because it affects the streams close to them. We've done a lot of analysis. We discovered indeed the problem is mostly located in the wealthier part of the county, and we're now ready to come with some policy solutions. It's going to be good for the streams if we solve this problem, which is raising a particular kind of development impact fee. There's no question that it will improve the health of the streams. But given that we know it will mostly improve the health of the streams in the places where this particular kind of impact is happening, in the wealthier part of Montgomery County, it's in effect, it's going to raise prices on those who are already wealthier. But it will have an impact on anybody who needs to get this particular kind of fee paid in some way. So we're going to need to reach out to affordable housing developers and see if we can format the fee in such a way that they would be able to support it. All great. But we're having this conversation about like how to do it, what would be the kind of affordability tools we'd want to bring into the picture. And we sort of stepped back for a moment and said, we never talked to affordable housing developers to try to choose what issue we wanted to work on for the streams. We never talked to communities of color or in the eastern part of the county about how we should direct our energies and effort and time on this particular stream protection issue. We picked one that we knew about and that was affecting streams where our members were from. And now on the backside, we want to make sure that we, have a reach out strategy, but we didn't even use it, define it. Our problem definition, right, was already narrowed the scope of what kinds of policy solutions were available to us. And it was a note to myself. It was a note to, my coalition. I don't think we're on the wrong track. We're doing a good thing for the streams here. And we're going to make sure that we, incorporate concerns for affordability. But is that even a thing that, maybe if we go and we talk to people who are involved in affordable housing, they'll tell us like, well, what we really experience is, something completely different. We really have conflicts around parking, and we end up doing surface parking lots because they're so much cheaper in this particular way. If you can help us solve that, then that will really help the streams with less stormwater runoff from our surface parking lots. I don't know. But, the policy tools are so complex, and you could solve things in so many ways. You could improve things for the environment in so many ways that what we need to be doing is picking identifying upfront our problems by being better listeners. So I'm echoing what you're saying, but I'm just saying this today struck me as a real live opportunity that we could have done a couple months ago and we didn't. And I hope to take that forward into the future.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that is really interesting, and it's another lovely thing about you to be so self-aware, to say, hey, this was a missed opportunity, and then publicly announce that. How many of us would hide away in shame and say and never tell anybody that there's something that we could have done better? So I really appreciate that. I also want to say, I think that, you know, we all need to learn a little bit more about things that are outside of our own, like, personal experience. I think that would solve a lot of problems. One of the great things about doing the pilot with Studio DC is that I hadn't worked with children in such a long time, and it had been a decade or two for the last time that I worked with kids. And I was struck by how different children are now, 16-year-olds are now, than they were when I used to work with them or when I was a 16-year-old. But particularly struck by how much more aware they were about what's going on in the world, and how much more access they have for information and how they're able to process information in a much more rapid clip. And so what I learned through that process is, if I'm trying to have an impact with that set of students, you got to bring your A game, because they are ready for you. They are
Sharp
ready
cookies.
for you. They are sharp. I mean, we were teaching them how to design for stormwater in a 10-week process, and Quentin is like, yeah, we need to calculate the surface runoff so that we can figure out what size cistern we need for our project. And I'm like, yeah, you'll need to talk to Kendra for that one, because I haven't done that calculation in a while. And also, it's not necessary just for conceptual design, but if that's what you want to do, we're going to encourage it. You know, they want to get it right. It's super smart, but also just dealing with a whole bunch of nonsense that we don't think about on a daily basis. We had 2 project sites. Quentin was in the Hickey Run subwatershed, but Kendra had the Watts Branch subwatershed, and they had a site that was a vacant parcel of land next to a grocery store. They go to the site to do investigative drawings, and there are people on the site who engage them in a very hostile way. And they say to a group of kids, you know, we rob people in this neighborhood. You know, we rob people in this neighborhood. And so Kendra and I have conceived of a nonprofit, put together a project. You know, Kendra in her own neighborhood brings a group of kids to a site. Who can anticipate that physical kind of threat in the daily lives of a 16-year-old in Washington, D.C.? And how is that acceptable? Do you know what I mean? And like, we wouldn't have known that that was happening if we didn't have this experience with them, you know? And if we weren't listening and trying to engage them and create a space where it was safe for them to share, you know, what they're working with. And we learned so much. There was one student said, we used to have these circle times where we would talk about different themes. And in the circle time, one student revealed that, you know, when I was a kid, everybody thought that I was cute. And now, when I walk down the street, people treat me like a threat. In your own personal daily lived experience, you walk down the street in your own neighborhood, you go through puberty, and then all of a sudden, you're no longer who you used to be. Can you imagine the psychological toll that takes on just an average kid just going to school every day in his own neighborhood?
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
It made me reflect on something I saw maybe in a Tree documentary about how kids on their way to school who had to navigate, I think this was in Chicago, who had to navigate gang territories to get to and from school, used the trees on their way in very specific ways to like hide behind certain sight lines, and they did not want new trees because new trees would change the way they felt safe navigating around the neighborhood, or would give the rival gang members new places to hide. And the community opposed new trees because of their fear about sightlines for shootings. And that's just, no, I can't imagine, you know, personally. Right.
Yeah. And this is a terrible form of traumatic experience that people have, and they connect this to nature. And this isn't like the old trauma, the old historic trauma that connects when we're talking about African Americans and nature. We don't even have to go back that far. We can go to like last week, you know, of what's happening in a natural space. It's interesting too, I live right next to the National Arboretum.
I want you to tell this whole story.
When I bought my house, some random block shopper wrote an article about how landscape architect buys house in Arboretum, as if that makes sense. I mean, I don't understand why that's newsworthy. And the great thing about the Arboretum is it's got tons of trees, and it's great because they create new cultivars of trees, which really help the industry, and everything is super beautiful. 400 acres of gorgeousness, really lovely. It's open from 8 to 5 every day. So even if you live in the neighborhood and you work outside your home, you don't get much of a chance to visit the National Arboretum. And during COVID, it was closed, just closed. That's signaling, right? That space, 400 acres in my own neighborhood, isn't for the people in that neighborhood. It's for people who visit from other countries and can get there during that time. That's nature in my own neighborhood that is not accessible most of the time. But even worse than that, Kendra again lives across the city. She went to Anacostia Park, or tried to, during COVID, and it was closed. So a National Park Service closed Anacostia Park in particular, but not the rest of the parks that they own in the city, like Rock Creek Park.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. But barricaded Anacostia Park during COVID, in the time where people need nature, and that was not by mistake. You know, all you have to do is look at the demographics on that side of the city to figure out why they did that. Wow, and barricaded with police presence. And so Kendra walks up, she's a millennial, so she walks up, engages the officer, super bubbly, super beautiful, super happy to figure out, hey, what's going on? And the officer did not receive her very well. And this is her on a trip as a landscape architect to go to her local landscape, being met with hostility from a police officer and go into a space that is supposed to be open to her.
Wow. Yeah. That's painful. Even from thinking about it from the outside, it's painful. And it's painful to know that I live near Rock Creek Park, and it's been my pandemic oasis. It's been open the whole time. You've been in a town with our kids. Yeah. Wow.
All the parks in Montgomery County, all open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even within DC, we're seeing differences across. So I want to come back to another issue that you touched on earlier. I think we could go deep into this, and I think we'll circle back to it. Come here, Doug. But I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, which was, so we have communities who have been disinvested in, who have not been listened to, and then they say no to the do-gooder ideas. And another example that came up during the pandemic in DC is slow streets. And again, to localize it, I have a slow street a block away from me, which is fairly useless, but nonetheless, I have one for whatever it's supposed to be, where cars are supposed to slow to 15 miles an hour and not use it for through traffic, only for locals. And Councilmember Trayon White said no slow streets in Ward 8. And I was wondering if, you could talk, I mean, you mentioned that this is a general thing, but what are some of the specifics at play and why he said that? And the slow streets passed without any, the enabling legislation passed with a specific exception for Ward 8 in order to get past the council.
Yeah, I mean, transportation issues, oh my gosh. I just wanted to tell the audience that I love you guys and don't get too mad at me when I start talking about transportation issues. I have very strong, hardly, probably poorly formed opinions around transportation, because that's not where my area of expertise is. I just use the streets like everyone else. I design landscapes, but I have opinions about streets. I think that is, your question is like, why no slow streets for Ward 8 is a great question. that some people should ask people who are in Ward 8. I have theories. Well, remember that Ward 8 is far less dense than the rest of the city. Even though we're supposed to be spread, the wards are supposed to be spread equally with the similar number of population, they're supposed to be about the same number of residents in each ward. It's supposed to be that way. But what happens in Ward 7 and 8 is that in order to keep the wards on that side of the river, they have to have smaller numbers. If you were to actually fairly distribute, like draw the lines for Ward 7 and 8, they would come across the river into like wards 5 and 6. And if you follow the planning process, it happens every redistricting, I think, happens every 10 years in DC. But if you follow that process, every year a council member from Ward 5 or 7 or 8 will propose that, hey, let's take part of Ward 6. Nope. Not happening, because that's a political thing. And if you look at the wealth disparities, you'll get a big pushback from the residents of Ward 6. So in Ward 7 and 8, there are different kinds of streets. There are less residents, and there isn't as much traffic. There might not be a need for slow streets in Ward 7 and 8. They may have, if we're looking at, I don't know, but if we're looking at Vision Zero, or we're thinking that we want to solve for, fatal car accidents, we would have to ask ourselves, is that an issue in Ward 8? Is that the thing that is doing the most harm to people in Ward 8? I would imagine that there are other issues that end up resulting in the loss of life in Ward 8 that are not related to transportation.
Right.
And if that is true, and those problems aren't being solved, then why would a council member solve something that's not a problem for him?
Right.
That's all speculation. I don't know. I haven't talked to Trayvon, so I don't know.
All right. Well, if you want to grab a sip of water, I'm going to go and spend a little time with our audience questions and pull one together for you. And we have a couple more questions about DC, but as I said, I think I'd like to come back to some of the equity issues around DC and let you turn to landscape architecture specifically, and planning and getting people involved in the process where you started. So a question that Leslie Lewis asked is, how do you connect with students and how do you invite community members into the process? Like really, I think she's looking for specifics, because a lot of community members are, as you pointed out, leery of working with people who, do-gooders or professional planners or landscape architects, design firms, usually for good reason based on past experience. So the question is, how do you build trust with, or maybe find trust bridges into local communities who do not have that trust as a planning process is getting started? What are some really concrete ideas you might have?
Yeah. So when we piloted, and we use this model now in our programming, but when we piloted the Studio DC project, we looked for 10 kids, and we wanted to work with them for 10 Saturdays. We wanted to teach them how to design for projects in their own neighborhood. And we wanted to do that in the fall while they had school. So we paid them money. We didn't ask them to voluntarily, out of their bleeding hearts, to come and learn how to design landscapes. No, we were like, you want to make $500? This is how you do it. You're going to learn this stuff, but you're going to make money in the process. We were getting paid for our time. We felt like they should also get paid for their time. We were learning in that process. And so the first thing is to meet a need for that community. Like, especially if you're a sort of special interest nonprofit, right? So I've worked in the tree game for a long time.
I have some tree questions for you coming too.
Thank you. I've worked in the tree game for a long time, and I know, like, we come to our work thinking that everyone loves trees and everyone should love trees, but everybody may not be tracking how wonderful trees are. But you know, if you're a kid and you're about to go into the fall semester, you want money for new kicks, you want money to take your friends out, you want, you know, to be able to sometimes money for your family to help support your family. And so for communities that are impoverished or, you know, who have a real need for money, you pay them. You don't expect people who need to make money to show up for free. It's also not fair, especially, again, like I said, if we're getting paid in that process. So that's the first step. The second step, I'm a designer, so I have an ego. I think my designs are great. I was engaging with my group, and they were very quick to tell me, no, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna do this instead. I'm like, are you sure you don't want, you know, this particular play set to go on this side that's right next to the rec center? You sure you don't want the garden to go right next to the water? No, it's cooler to have it over here. And I just had to let it go. And so some of it is like, you know, letting go of your expertise or letting go of your ego and engaging with people as if they're people and they're as valuable as you are in this process, right? And so, but the most important thing is that the way we're doing things, like the projects that we're doing, you hinted to this, Eliza, the projects that we're doing might not be the right projects, might not be solving the right problem. And so doing a little bit of like digging, research, seeking to understand, explore a little bit more, think about how our projects could be more inclusive. And it may be the actual structure of your volunteer program or your engagement strategies. Maybe there's a flaw in that. And if you want to know why people aren't interested, a good way to find that out is to ask people what they need and give them that.
So we have a couple other specific questions on this. And one person I think is like really asking for, if you have any advice on, and I'll tell you the question, but then I'll say freely go above and beyond. So she's asking, what are the most successful types of community forums, like presentations, tabling, larger informal Q&A? I would add to that a design charrette, you know, and what should be avoided. And I'll put my own gloss on it, which is that I assume it really is context dependent, what tool you would use for community outreach. Right now, it would be Zoom, you know, or maybe a big outdoor demo or something. But when you think about the difference between a community member who lives in a community and a sort of professional who's coming in from the outside, what are some ways that you can break down those invisible barriers, like physically or with materials or in the way you set up your presentation that can make it more open and accessible and inviting to people who might otherwise feel a little shut out?
My instinct is to say that you can't put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. That's my but that's just my knee-jerk flippant kind of response. In truth, I think the engagement process where you have experts who are all from outside of the community isn't engagement. Like if the design team doesn't have any members from like the neighborhood informing the actual design, that's not engagement. That's not that.
I want to just repeat that, what you just said.
Yeah.
So if a design team and a planning team is coming to a neighborhood to try to take community input, and they do not already have someone who lives in that neighborhood working on their team, then how will they successfully get the community input, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, you don't have, it's a very similar, you don't have enough of a frame of reference to know how to engage that community or what their values are. But you do know how to do what you've been trained to do and what you've done repeatedly, right? You know how to put together a slide deck. You know how to tell people what their problems are and what you're solving for, which was already prescribed by, you know, the scope of work, right? Like I'm in here to design X, Y, and Z, and it's going to be sustainable. We're designed to lead silver, and we're going to do this already. So most of the decisions have already been made in the scope of work. Then you come in front of a community, and then you tell them what your scope of work is. And then you ask them what you think. Hey, what do you think of our scope of work? Well, I think that I should have been engaged before you created the scope of work so I can tell you what our problems are. And so that the city that represents us, that uses our funding to pay you, actually solves a problem that is of interest to us. Like, but you can solve for that too, because there are always in every community, there are always people, not just the ANC commissioners in DC or like the elected officials or the volunteers for the neighborhood association, but there are also always citizens who are engaged deeply in these processes, and it's all part of the public record. You can find out who they are, or you can just ask somebody on the street and they will tell you who would want to participate. You bring them on very early in the process, and I'm gonna get back to this, and you pay them for their time.
Yeah.
As experts, because they are experts of lived experience. They have more value in this process than the people who are coming outside of that neighborhood can bring to that process.
So we have a number of questions that are asking for like specific examples about how do you engage with a historically African American community that has lost trust? Can you comment on place-based design and historical factors, any urban design projects or programs that have engaged Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in an authentic way? And it feels to me like I'm not actually going to ask you all those questions because I think you've been answering them repeatedly, which is start much earlier than you think you need to and hire local people to inform on the process. I mean, right? Or would you answer any of those questions? Would you add anything to that?
I mean, I think also just kind of like looking at your staff. This is a rabbit hole. I just went down. I'm about to go down a rabbit hole.
All right, go for it.
So here's the deal. One of the things that they say when they're trying to figure out why certain organizations aren't diverse, it's because a lot of times people hire from their friend group, right? So like if you are in an organization that has like a monoculture of people, that's because a lot of times information is shared through existing networks. And if your network is very narrow, then you might not be connected with those networks that can help make your organization more diverse. But the power of diversity isn't really just like the color or the outside skin or the shell that a person is in. Power of diversity is like having the space to articulate ideas that are different and a platform in which those ideas are heard. And so if you don't know how to engage communities of color, that's a reflection on your starting point. Your network isn't diverse enough to begin with. And we need to think creatively about how to solve that problem, right? But we also need to know, like in these COVID times and Black Lives Matters time, and now everybody wants to talk about diversity, your diverse friends are exhausted. Like they are exhausted from having these conversations. And just because a person comes from a Black background of color doesn't make them an expert in how to engage diverse communities. That is actually a skill set. And you can find that skill set by looking at a person's resume and credentials. And there's a lot has been done, especially in like planning theory from like the 1970s, super amazing stuff that's never been fully implemented. But a lot of times artists have a different perspective on how to engage, which is a much more open process than we do. And what's really great when you see when artists engage in a public process is that, somebody's dancing, somebody's singing, somebody's drawing. It's a visceral, tactile experience, and people show up and people have fun. And let's try some of that. Let's like break through sort of, if you're saying, how do I engage this group that I have never engaged before? You change your engagement. You start from zero, throw your engagement out the window, and find people who are doing it better. And a lot of times those are the artists. Those are the dancers, the singers, the people who want to draw, the people who want to have fun. And you do those engagements over a long period of time. You hire people not just because of their color or lack of color or whatever, you also hire them because of their skill set and their ability to actually, their proven track record of actually doing something new and fresh and different as far as engagement is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
We throw out the playbook, we start over and do something better.
I'm inspired to make a plug for a specific organization that is called the Management Center. I don't know if anybody knows about it, but they help nonprofits and progressive campaigns. You don't have to be a progressive campaign, but you do have to be in a nonprofit to take their courses. And they have a huge focus on equity, and like people are asking a lot of how-to questions, and what is not in is like, okay, so how do we actually diversify? How do we actually find people outside of our networks? And I want to say this is a skill set. You can train on it. And I took the Management Center training, and they train you on how to get your job descriptions right, on how to check the boxes when you're networking for new job descriptions to make sure that you're reaching a diverse group. And most importantly, how to self-evaluate and reflect on your values so that you are actually focusing only on the values that are most important and getting rid of the ones that are just your bias to try to stuff that's in your head that's not important to the work that you actually do. And they have a lot of free resources available online as well, which Sarah Clark pointed out. And there's other kinds of trainings available, but I happen to have taken that one. They didn't pay me for this pitch. I just want to let you all know that I found it really helpful in hiring people with new ideas. Yeah.
I'm obsessed with the Management Center. They have.
Me too.
They're obsessed. It's an obsession. I read the book, drank the Kool-Aid, tried to get a job there. They were like, nah, sis. I mean, obsessed with them. But you should note that on their website, they also have just like free resources, everything from like how to how to evaluate your staff to like how to manage up, you know, every part of the strategic planning process for your organization. They have their values-based organization with a clear mission. And they believe that nonprofits they have big problems to solve. And in order to do that well, they have to be managed well. I mean, they're holding nonprofits accountable for management. It's like, what more could you want? Like, yeah. I'm obsessed with management. So. And
equity. Is a huge value that they're teaching you how to actually operationalize.
Yeah, they're amazing.
As long as we're talking about institutions, we have a couple questions for you about the Urban Studio.
Yes.
So the first question that came in was from Shannon, who asked, do you have any research frameworks? Have you worked with any social scientists in order to reflect on some of the processes that you've been developing around facilitating community meetings and incorporating feedback? Is that something that the Urban Studio has pursued or would like to?
It is something that we would definitely like to pursue. We have as a member of our board, we're working board, a member of our board, Jen Lowe, has created an engagement process. This is some amazing stuff. She got a master's in integrated design at the University of Michigan. And I was watching her thesis presentation because I'm that much of a geek. And she did this project called Dear Chinatown for her thesis, where she studied engagement in Chinatown in Washington, D.C. And part of her work was to have people who are participating in the Festival for the New Year to create love letters to Chinatown. And she did that process where you would go, you draw your love letter, and then she would turn it over and code it in our top secret social scientist coding. And then she would pin them up as part of that process. But that coding and like her secret sauce is a way to interpret this art as research for her to finish her thesis, formulate her thesis, and then to come up with her theory. And it was absolutely brilliant. And that kind of engagement is fun. People want to do it. They volunteer to do it. They're communicating with you in a way, and she's able to interpret that communication. So her research is grounded in research that comes from art as opposed to social science. And she's in the process of writing a book, and we're in the process of piloting some of those efforts with a couple of clients in Baltimore right now, clients in Baltimore, and I think in Utah as well. And we're doing some stuff in Los Angeles. So we're currently, so our, like the Studio DC project, the Studio Los Angeles project, they're all part of us evolving into being able to use these more creative processes, more like grounded research that we're doing. So it's not traditional social science research, but it is grounded theory, and it's pretty interesting and exciting and fun. But we want to do more of that, of course, and we want to partner with people to do more of that. And you can hit us up at the studio.
Shannon, please reach out to Maisie if you have ideas on how to help make that happen.
Yeah.
All right, so folks, I want to continue to encourage you to put a few more questions in the box. We do have enough to carry us through, but if you've got something particularly juicy, now's the time to make sure that we have it and can get it to Maisie. And I'll continue to encourage folks to use the chat box if you want to kind of just share some commentary. Again, we'll be able to look at it afterwards when we can focus in a little better on the running chat. But my next question for you, Maisie, is from Jennifer. And oh, Shannon, I did see in the chat, Shannon said she'll be in touch with research ideas. So my next question is from Jennifer, and it's about forests and trees. So how do we engage around urban forest and health? What is the first step in your mind about engaging with green space? And I'm going to say I think engaging is a really big word for this. And so maybe we could target it a little better and say, like, how do we make sure that urban forests and the health that they provide is not only nearby but accessible, and that people feel that they're accessible? From like forests. Let's talk forests. Let's talk your day job.
Yeah. So my understanding of the definition of urban forestry is that in an urban forest, it's every single tree in that urban area, right? Which is different than a park space or a forest space or what have you. The reason that I'm saying that is because urban forests as a term is great for looking at the city holistically, like every single tree together collectively create this forest. In policy around that level of planning, it's critically important. You need to protect every single tree and get more trees in the city, of course. But when we're thinking about like parks and forests in cities as individual places that people can visit, that's all about design. That's landscape architecture, baby. That's the stuff I like to talk about. What you'll find is, especially like if you look at like Park Score or if you look at Parks RX, like you'll find out that, you know, all parks aren't designed equally. You might have a high, you know, Park Score, but your park may be garbage. The park that's closest to your house may be unmaintained, poorly designed, unsafe for you to be there, right? Whereas the park across town may be super lovely. So you may have a high Park Score, but that's not going to help you want to actually go to that space because it's not well designed. And so I've seen research that has made the suggestion that because planting trees in neighborhoods or like revamping a park in neighborhood causes displacement, we have to design in what translates into a mediocre way for urban spaces to prevent displacement. And that's the
next question I have for you is how do we prevent displacement from gentrification from improved design? Like, what are your thoughts? This comes up all the time in my day job.
Okay, I have to plug my laptop in or we're not going to be talking.
Go, no problem.
I didn't realize it wasn't plugged in. Sorry.
Don't. That's good. Plugging in is important. Everybody, I'll take this moment to plug. Feel free to introduce yourself, continue to discuss in the chat box what you're hearing and thinking, and Q&A in the question and answer. Although at this time, I'm probably not going to take too many more Q&As. We're going to go out with gentrification and displacement, and then I'm going to ask Maisie to predict the future, and we'll close with that.
I'm going to totally wrong about the future. Okay, so the issue with displacement is that displacement, like, if you're getting trees planted in your neighborhood, that's not the beginning of a process, that's the end of a process. That is the end of the planning process that starts with like a zoning map in a plan for your entire city. It's broken down to a neighborhood plan or a development plan. And then they build, or they start the process of building, and then displacement happens. Displacement is a byproduct of the development process, not the tree planting process. And so first you have to understand basically how planning works in urban areas, because none of this should be shocking to us. If you put in like a new high-end mixed use, building in a neighborhood, prices go up, because because that's the reason they put a new high-end mixed use building in the neighborhood. This is not a shock, it's commerce, it's basic, it's basic urban commerce. And so how do we solve that? Well, we get cities to invest in existing neighborhoods. No strings attached. Wait a minute, use money that citizens pay you to live in your city to improve their neighborhoods without the development. Like, you can still have developers come in and they can still develop new places. I'm not anti-development. That's how landscape architects make a lot of money from working with developers. So I'm not that obtuse. But, and also existing neighborhoods, work with them, design with them, without necessarily having a development project in the pipeline as your reason for doing that. Like, activate the planners in the Office of Planning to do plans with the neighborhood. Like, they've stopped doing like neighborhood plans. What? And so, like, wait a minute, do that. And plan for existing neighborhoods, provide amenities for existing neighborhoods. And then people trust that you're not there trying to like kick them out of their homes, because you're just trying to improve their existing neighborhood as part of a process, as if you as a representative of the city are beholden to all residents of that city. It's almost like democracy.
Yeah.
Try some of that.
Almost. All right, so now I'm going to ask you to take us out on a prediction of the future. So we went heavy with real problems that cities have, and real problems that particular populations within cities have. And to put a real fine point on it, Black and brown people in our cities who are dealing with the legacies of many overlapping systemic crises have. And that we need to, in order to start solving those problems, we need to zoom back, begin at the beginning. You said don't put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. I am worried that in a post-COVID world, frankly, especially if we have a second Trump term, we'll see a big wave of disinvestment in cities. I think that's been clearly signaled in the campaign. And just because of the pandemic, people who can afford to, many are leaving cities. They're going to where there's more space, there's more green space, it's easier to socially distance, it's cooler. As long as we're stuck in our homes and people don't have to worry about commuting to their jobs, they're taking advantage of telework to go further away. So I'm worried. I'm worried about the tax base of cities. I'm worried about the investment, the ability to invest the kind of funds that it's going to take to address these long-term equity issues. But there may also be opportunities to go along with those risks. And I think a second Trump term could be particularly problematic in this regard, but it's a trend no matter what. It's a pandemic-related trend, and it's an economic-related trend that could continue regardless of the federal level. It has local factors as well. And so what do you see? I see the risks. I wonder if you share those feelings of risk, but also if you see any opportunities, if you see any ways in which this crisis that we're going through now can give us opportunities to shape a better future.
Oh, I think it already has. I think that these crises have helped us to think. It's revealed a lot about people, a lot about how we think, a lot about how we treat our citizenry, and a lot of like interesting perspective. My best friend and I, we talk a lot, and she just couldn't understand why people were protesting in the middle of a pandemic and risking their lives to demonstrate to their government that they feel that something is happening and it's wrong and it needs to stop. But if you take like a closer look at those crowds are incredibly diverse. And that idea that this is something that is happening in spite of the pandemic is probably not correct. It's probably something that's happening because of the pandemic, something that wouldn't have happened or started or ignited if people weren't quarantined at the time, you know? So it put an issue that was very important on the world stage, and it forced a conversation, and is continuing to force a conversation. And people are changing because now it's become unpopular not to. And so tremendous growth in that area as it relates to equity, and everybody wants to talk about equity now. So that's incredibly promising. But these are hard, difficult, challenging conversations, because these are hard, difficult, challenging issues, and it's going to be painful to get through it. And so for me, my concern isn't so much about whether or not people opt to not live in cities anymore. I have a lot to say about how obvious it is that that would have been an outcome from the recent, like, move back into cities, like that whole development process around creating cities for young people who don't have children, who are educated, who want something cool to do in the evening, who want to have amenities, building cities for those people, and not investing in wraparound services for the young and the old, and not investing in existing residents, but just kind of going with this wave of cities are cool now, so let's all move there. The natural consequence of that is, like, when cities aren't cool anymore, when people can't afford to live there, they're going to leave. They're going to opt to, you know, and suburban places have created these rival mini cities, right? Like they've densified in a way that they have amenities, they have great Indian food. So you don't have to be in DC to have access to all of the things. You can be in the suburbs to have that. And that's part of, like, the competition. That's part of the problem with, like, creating these really superficial, contrived planning processes that are in themselves not sustainable. That is the consequence of unsustainable planning. That's what it is. And so could make the case that cities were overinvested in, or that the groups of people that they were designing cities for are more transient than the long-term residents who've been there the entire time. And this is from a person, because I'm part of the problem. I'm from Montgomery County myself and moved to the city as part of this trend of everybody's moving to the cities. So I'm not even taking myself out of that issue. So that's a planning problem that planners created, and the bubble bursts, and people will change their choice. Environmental factors will make cities uninhabitable. You spent too much time debating whether or not green roofs work when you should have been putting in green roofs. Like, I mean, if the science is true, and we know the science is true, cities are not going to be habitable. Like, I hope you have a property somewhere else that you can go to when, you know, when the sewer system no longer works and everything starts to flood and it's too hot to walk down the street. We're already getting there. That's just the way it is. And that's independent of this particular administration.
It is, yeah.
That is independent of this particular administration. The great thing about the American model is term limits. That's the best thing. But one of the challenges with our version of democracy is it's slow moving. People are knuckleheaded. And it takes a long time to get anything done. So yeah, it's going to be a problem that's going to have to be solved with politicians, but also independently of politicians. People are going to have to rise to the occasion and take control of their lives and their country in a way that creates the change that we want to see.
Yeah, so let's go out on that note. Let's go out on taking control and making the changes we want to see. Is there anything else you want to share with us before we close tonight, Maisie?
I do want to thank everyone who spent their entire day on Zoom meetings and then spent additional time to listen to me talk about all of these issues with our cities. I really appreciate that. If you're interested in learning more about the Urban Studio, you can go to theurbanstudio.org, and we have some information there, or you can always hit me up in the many of ways for the social medias, but also you can email me, Maisie at theurbanstudio.org.
I am going to put that up on a closeout slide so that it's easy for people to see. Maisie at theurbanstudio.org. And let's get that up and share the screen. Okay. And I also want to thank everyone so much for coming. Those of you, well, you're all here, but anybody who registered and missed the talk will be getting the recording as soon as possible. And if you want to share the talk, we'll encourage you to send them to the same registration page that you went to, anshome.org/events/Conservation Café, and they'll find instructions for how to get the talk. If you want to make donations to the Urban Studio, you are more than welcome to do so. I assume they have that set up on their website at theurbanstudio.org. So please do.